So we're now in a position to see why relativism is supposed to do better both than contextualism and than invariantism. So let's take contextualism first. Remember, we said the really serious problem appears to be the problem of disagreement. According to contextualism, when the non-skeptic says, I know I have hands, and the skeptic says, no you don't, they're just asserting completely different propositions. So the non-skeptic is saying that they know by low standards that they have hands, and the skeptic is denying that they know by high standards that they have hands. But of course that wasn't what the non-skeptic asserted in the first place, according to contextualism. So it's hard to see why there should be any sort of disagreement going on here. As we saw in the last lecture, the way that relative truth is hooked up to the rules for assertion and rejection is explicitly supposed to make sense of how we assert and reject things. So let's think about our situation again. We have, say, Alice, the non-skeptic, who says, I know I have hands. And we have Billy, the skeptic, who says, no, you don't know that. So what's going on here according to the relativist? Well, according to the relativist, Alice is allowed to assert what she does assert. It's permissible for her to assert things like that, because the sentence is true as assessed from her context of assessment. So remember, when you are asserting things, according to the relativist, the rule is you should assert something just in case it's true as assessed from the context of use. Or put differently, it's true when the context of use is taken to be the same as the context of assessment. So because Alice is a non-skeptic and she has low standards, things like, I know I have hands, are going to come out true relative to her context of assessment. So first of all, we see that Alice is perfectly justified in saying what she does when she says, I know I have hands. Now the crucial step is to explain why is it permissible for the skeptic to disagree with this, because this is what was hard for the contextualist to explain. It wasn't clear why the skeptic should be allowed to disagree, because they're just talking about something else, and usually talking about something else doesn't suffice for disagreement. And here we got to remember what the relativist rule for rejection was. Remember, the relativist rule for rejection said you can reject a sentence as used in some other context when it's false in your context of assessment. So Billy the skeptic can reject Alice's use of the sentence, I know I have hands, when it's false according to his context of assessment. And remember, we're saying that Billy is a skeptic, so things like brain and vat worlds are going to be relevant to him, and so it is indeed going to be false relative to his context of assessment that Alice knows that she has hands, because her evidence is not going to be able to rule out things like that. So those are the rules of how assertion and rejection are supposed to work. But we might return to the objection we leveled against contextualism, which is that, according to contextualism, the skeptic is just rejecting a different proposition from the one asserted by the non-skeptic. Is it true, according to relativism, that the skeptic is rejecting the same proposition that the non-skeptic is asserting? And MacFarlane wants to say the answer is yes. Even though you get these different patterns of assertion and rejection, they are disagreeing over the same proposition. And the reason why this can be possible is that the same proposition about Alice's knowing whether she can have hands can be true or false at different contexts of assessment. So remember, we already saw the idea that propositions can be true at different times. So the proposition, I'm eating, might be true at one time and false at a later time. In a similar way, MacFarlane wants to say, propositions like, I know I have hands, can be true or false at different contexts of assessment. So Alice and Billy are disagreeing over the same proposition, even though in some sense they're both right. Because the proposition they're disagreeing over is true as assessed by Alice, the person who is asserting it, and it's false as assessed by Billy, the person who's rejecting it. So by introducing this idea that propositions can be true or false relative to things like context of assessment, we can make sense of both how standards can play a role in the way that we agree and disagree with propositions, but nonetheless say that people with different standards are disagreeing over the same thing. So relativism looks like it can do better with the problem of disagreement. We get an explanation of why the skeptic is able to disagree with the non-skeptic. It's that the rules for assertion and rejection are hooked up to relative truth in such a way that in order to reject something, it just has to be false in your context of assessment. So even though it was true for Alice to say it in her context of assessment, she asserted it perfectly correctly. It's false in the context of assessment of the audience in this case, and for that reason the audience is allowed to reject it. So we get an explanation of why we're supposed to be able to assert and disagree about things like knowledge, even when there are a variety of different standards in play. Now remember, the last objection to contextualism that we talked about, which I haven't mentioned yet, was this objection from standards and not being able to make clear in ordinary language what standards you're talking about. So the observation was that unlike words like tall, we don't have ways in ordinary English for making clear what kinds of standards of knowledge we're talking about. Now, as philosophers, we've introduced ways of talking about it, but these aren't sort of things that ordinary people do, arguably. It's not really clear that relativism actually does better on this objection in the end, because relativists too have to appeal to the notion of standards. The notion of standards are there, and they're very important. It's just they get into the semantics in a slightly different way. The standards don't get in through the context of use, rather they get in through the context of assessment. And even though this is slightly different maybe from how they get into the semantics for tall, it's not really clear why this would suffice to explain the difference between tall and nose. If standards really are there, but they come in through the context of assessment, it's not really clear why it should be any less surprising that we're not able to talk about them in ordinary English. So it's not really clear that relativism actually really explains what's going on with this objection. As we said, this doesn't seem like the more serious of the two objections, so that is not necessarily itself a problem. Next, we got to think about invariantism. So why does the view do better than invariantism? Basically, the reason it does better is that relativism is able to say the same thing about knowledge destruction as the contextualists did. So let's go to the board to see that in a little bit more detail. So the last thing we're going to do is see that it's not true in any context of assessment that when you go through skeptical reasoning or you go through lottery reasoning, you lose knowledge. So let's look at a concrete situation. We're going to imagine Alice starts off in a low standard context where it's true for her to say things like, I know I have hands. Here's a little picture of her starting to worry about whether she's a brain in a vat. And she ends up in a context where she says things like, I don't know whether I have hands. And to start with, let's imagine this is all being assessed by Billy, who is a skeptic in a different context. So he's in a separate context, assessing what's going on with Alice, using his own standards. So the first question is it true, relative to Billy, that Alice used to know that she had hands but no longer does? And the answer, as I hope maybe you'll see by now, is no. It's not true relative to Billy's context of assessment that Alice used to know at the earlier time, but then fails to know later on. Rather, what's true in Billy's context of assessment is that Alice never knew that she had hands. Because first of all, is it true at the earlier time, relative to Billy's context of assessment, that Alice knows she has hands? Well, remember, Billy's standards are high, so that's not going to be the kind of thing that Alice knows, given his standards. On the other hand, Billy will think that the thing she says later on, I don't know whether I have hands, is true, because that is the kind of thing that's going to be true relative to his high standards. So it's not like with the invariantist that there's some time where, relative to Billy's context, where it's true earlier on for Alice to say that she knows she has hands, and false later on to say it. Rather, relative to Billy's context of assessment, it was just false all along for Alice to say that she knows she has hands. So it's just not true that she, according to Billy's context of assessment, she used to know that she had hands. It's just never true. And we saw that looks like the intuitive answer. That when you're in a skeptical frame of mind, really it looks like what you want to say is not that you lost knowledge because you did some skeptical reasoning, but rather it seems to show you that you never had the knowledge in the first place. And it looks like relativism is getting a little bit better of a result here in capturing that. For the same reason, so we've been thinking about a case where Billy has been assessing Alice, but Alice should think at this point, when she looks back to her earlier self, she should think the same thing. Because we can ask, well, not just should Billy say that Alice never knew, what should Alice say about herself? And in fact, by the time she's gotten to the high standards context, Alice should say just the same thing about herself. Because when she looks back, relative to her later context of assessment, where remember the standards are high, what she said earlier on is going to be false. So once she's in this context of assessment, what she said earlier on is going to be false. So from her point of view, from the later context of assessment, again, there's no earlier time at which it was true for her to say she knows she has hands. Because the way she assesses even those earlier claims is relative to her current context of assessment. And her current context of assessment is a one with high standards. So just as it's true in Billy's context that Alice never knew, it's also true in Alice's later context that she never knew as well. So again, relative to Alice's later context, there's no knowledge being destroyed. It was never true all along in this context of assessment that she knew. The last thing we should ask is whether Alice's later utterance is true relative to her earlier context of assessment. So is she, from the point of view of her earlier context, is what she says later on true? But again, it looks like the answer is no. Because given her earlier context of assessment, when she has low standards, things like, I don't know whether I have hands, are going to be false things to say. Or at least it's going to be false that she's not in a position to know whether she has hands. Because, of course, having hands is the kind of thing that you can know, given low standards. Now, case is a little bit tricky about because there is some sort of instability here. Because if Alice was to take up the question for herself, whether her later utterance is true, well, presumably considering this kind of context, or brain in the vat worlds are relevant, will actually tend to push her from out of her current low stakes or low standards context into a high standards context. However, it just is a fact, whether or not that's a fact that's easy for her to access. It is a fact that, given her current low standards, her later claim is false. So again, even from the point of view of her earlier context, no knowledge is lost. From the point of view of all three contexts of assessment, either you knew all along, or you never knew. So in this case, given low standards, it's true that you knew all along. In these cases, given high standards, it's true that you never knew at any point. So there's no context of assessment from which knowledge is lost, unlike what the invariantist said.